Let's talk a little bit about the Boolean type. Just as a reminder to help orient ourselves, we said previously that we can divide data types in C++ up into several categories. And in discussing the Boolean type, we're down here in the fundamental types category. As we saw before, we can divide fundamental types up into Boolean, character, integer, floating point, and technically void. And today let's talk about Boolean. Now you're likely familiar with the Boolean type from your previous programming experience. A Boolean type is a type that can take just two values. It can take true or it can take false. So a lot of times it's used in logical tests like an if statement, for example. And it might be interesting to know that even though you could theoretically, of course, store true or false in just one bit of information, right? Just on or off, 1 or 0. Boolean types are typically stored in 1 byte of memory on most systems. Now in C++, we use the keyword bool for this data type. So for example, I could create a Boolean variable called b1. Here I'm just going ahead and initializing it to true using that uniform initialization syntax, also known as list initialization syntax that we discussed before. I could just as easily create one and initialize it to false. You'll probably notice that I'm already immediately violating my own advice about meaningful variable names, right? But I did give that caveat in the video that for some of these simple examples where I'm just trying to demonstrate data types, I'm not going to come up with very creative descriptive variable names sometimes. Now one thing that might be helpful to know sometimes is that when integers are converted into Booleans, a 0 value is interpreted as false and anything that is non-zero is interpreted as true. So for example, we could have an int value. Let's just store 42 in there. And by the way, I'm intentionally using the older assignment syntax, the initialization syntax here. I'll explain why in a moment. We could create another Boolean, a third Boolean, and store that x value over into the Boolean. And what's going to happen here is that since x contained 42, and x is now placed over into b3, b3 would actually be interpreted as true. Same idea with false, right? We could have an integer variable that we initialize to 0. We could create a Boolean that gets that value. And guess what? That Boolean would be interpreted as false. Now the reason I didn't use list initialization syntax up here is that this would be a narrowing conversion. When we're trying to stuff an int into a Boolean variable, that's actually a narrowing conversion, so the compiler would not allow that if I were using the list initialization syntax. We saw before that that's actually one of the benefits of list initialization syntax. Now moving in the other direction, when a Boolean is converted to an integer, false has the value 0 and true has the value of 1. So if I were to do something like this and store the value of that Boolean variable b3 back over into the int variable x, x would have the value of 1. If instead I told x that it should hold the value inside b4, well, we saw that that was false. The Boolean b4 is false, so now x is 0. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of how you could convert back and forth between ints and Boolean types and what would happen in those situations. This also means that by default, if you display a Boolean value, you are presented with either a 0 or a 1. So let me go up here. It's a future video in which we're going to talk in more detail than we did in the Hello World example, about input and output streams and so forth. But let's go ahead and just for the sake of demonstrating what I'm talking about with Booleans, Here we're just going to be displaying the values stored in B1, B2, B3, and B4 out to the console window so we can take a look at them. And again, don't be too flustered by how to use cout and so forth. We'll talk about that soon enough. So in order to compile and run this program, and I was just about to hit a keyboard shortcut, but I held back here. So we could go to debug, start without debugging, right? It's one of the ways that we can have Visual Studio compile and then run our program for us. And we can see that indeed B1 is 1, B2 is 0, B3 is 1, and B4 is 0. Again, because unless we tell cout otherwise by means of a stream manipulator, which we haven't covered yet, Booleans are going to be displayed as 1s or 0s, depending on whether their values are true or false. Okay, so that was a brief introduction to the Boolean type in C++. Let's continue on with our exploration of fundamental types by talking about the character type next.